What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. So this is where I talk about stuff that is too long, too complicated, too not necessarily on topic or direct or however you want to call it, that I don't want to put in a regular video. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Actually, we were going to be talking about a couple of things today. So, yeah. First off, I want to address the setup, I guess, that what you're seeing here. So I'm playing with chroma keying. I recently re-rigged a part of my workspace to allow me to run a green screen. It's not a perfect solution yet. I'm not sure how I want to go with this. I'm working on my typical try, adapt, expand, etc. process where I iterate with less expensive processes to see if I can get something that I find acceptable as a result. So I'm just using some chroma key background paper that I have. It's not really the right size. It should really be wider, but it's good enough for an experiment like this. And as I said, the podcast, I talk about stuff that's too in-depth or too detailed to really talk about on the primary episodes for it, as well as like my thoughts on things in photography and that kind of thing. But it's also for me a perfect place to experiment with doing something that I just don't normally do and being able to see how that works out. So that's what we're trying it here. Now, eventually, it may move into being how I produce a lot of the regular content with virtual sets until, well, I have a, blazing big studio and actual real sets, which probably will need not anytime soon. But, it is what it is. So if you're wondering what's up with the background and why it looks suddenly different, that's what it is. It's a virtual set. It's also giving me the opportunity to learn Blender and Unreal Engine 5 eventually and start playing around with producing sort of realistic, renders and backgrounds and stuff like that. So, with that said, let's move on to what I wanted to talk about today as a whole. So earlier this week, the first episode went up of what is being at least termed internally the month of white balance. So I'm looking at white balance. I'm going to be looking at all of the ins and outs of white balance, so sort of on the R5. I'm going to do the same thing on the R5C. This week's video, I believe, was the sort of overview and background, what is white balancing and so forth. And then I'm going to wrap this all up by looking at actual ways, the different ways to white balance your camera on, with, reflective, incident, and through alternative, all of those means and some alternative ways to go about doing that instead of just using a white target, what other things you could possibly use. So, that's going to be, basically the next 4, 5, 6 weeks, something like that, worth of videos. We're going to be looking at all of that. This is certainly a little bit of inside baseball behind the scenes about what's going on with some of those videos, because some of the stuff I'm going to talk about in this podcast hasn't published yet. It'll publish in a couple of weeks, and we will be dealing with that. So the first thing I want to kind of talk about is testing. I like to test things. I don't necessarily think it's always a great idea to just take a camera manufacturer or whatever's word at, it's better. Maybe this just comes from my background in sort of computers and stuff like that, where video card companies and even CPU manufacturers have historically cheated on benchmarks. Or in the case currently, you have Apple. And don't get me wrong, I have a MacBook Pro. I'm an Apple user. I'm also a Windows user. I'm also a Linux user. I don't really like any one specific operating system. And in fact, on the total tangent there, I really like having all three OSs because they all have strengths and weaknesses that I can, put in, where things work in different ways or different things do better in one fashion or another. Anyway, as I was saying, Apple currently provides benchmark numbers for their new computers that are borderline useless. well, they're not borderline useless. They really are useless. They do everything in their power to obfuscate and confuse and conceal the testing, the test conditions, etc. So you get benchmarks that say things like this new processor, the M1, M2, whatever, is 7 times faster than something else, and you go try to dig out what the something else is, and it's 7 times faster than a 5-year-old processor from Intel or something like that. It's not, they're not saying that up front. In some cases, they are barely disclosing all of the information necessary to replicate the tests. And of course, if you watch independent reviewers independently reviewing stuff, the ones that actually do benchmark testing, well, they find that they don't always have the ability to reproduce what the manufacturers are saying. And again, I'm not just limiting this to Apple. This applies, across the board. So from that background, I don't always just trust that, well, Canon says X, so X is what it must be. I kind of have to do a little bit of testing. So I went into this looking to test things. Now, testing stuff is always a challenge. And I have to keep reminding myself throughout this process that if it was easy, everybody else would have already done it, and I wouldn't need to do it at all. So trying to provide information, trying to find stuff that is useful and meaningful is always, it's difficult. And this whole process, there has been a lot of learning that has been happening through the just evolution of looking at, doing some tests, coming back. Oh, what do I need to do? Do I need to evaluate this? How do I need to evaluate that? That kind of whole process is not exactly the easiest thing to do. Couple that with biases. We all have them. Anybody who says they're not biased about things, they're blinded by their own biases about how unbiased or how biased they are. And I really noticed this in the way that I did some of this testing. So, for example, when I was testing the auto white balance on the R5, I really was approaching it from the perspective that I have as a, R5 RAW shooter. So I shoot RAW. If you know anything about RAW, and I talk about this in several of these upcoming videos, and I think I've talked about it in the past, RAW does not, and I certainly talked about it in the last podcast talking about is RAW dying. RAW does not have any baked-in white balance. The white balance is just metadata to your post-processing software to go ahead and process or figure out what it needs to, how it needs to render the images. And because of that, there's zero penalty or problem with shooting a wrong white balance when you're shooting RAW. So I shoot auto white balance all the time. I basically never use anything else, because if I know that I'm going to go into post and I want this to be warmer, I can change the white balance and I have zero quality loss. So not having to worry about that in the field when I'm shooting RAW is not a huge issue. And I went into the white balance testing a little bit from that perspective. So I wasn't necessarily on the R5 looking to see how accurate the camera was getting things. The light source was 5120 Kelvin and the camera got 5300 Kelvin or something like that. I was looking to see sort of where the tipping point was for ambience priority versus white priority, and sort of a more broader, visceral maybe look at what the camera was doing. And because, like I said, I shoot RAW, it doesn't matter. I don't have to worry about the white balance being off. I can always make an adjustment in post. Now, if you shoot JPEG, that's a bigger issue. Getting things spot on is more important. And this also applies to video, which, again, yeah, we have RAW video, but I don't shoot it. I shoot MP4 because it's the most reasonable file sizes that I have for the content that I'm producing, and the fact that, I'm not Linus Media Groups, and I can't afford a petabyte storage server to archive all of my 8K raw footage on, there's the combination of no real use for it, no way to really store it, and no huge benefit in terms of quality. I mean, yes, there is some, but no huge benefit in terms of quality to what I'm actually producing. So I don't shoot it. I shoot compressed. I'm sure a lot of us that are out there shooting video, especially for YouTube, aren't shooting raw. We are shooting compressed. And this puts us in much more of a situation that is more akin to shooting JPEG on a still camera. Actually getting the color balance right in camera when it's doing the processing is kind of important. And so while I didn't really care about that when I was testing the R5, because again, I was thinking, you know, raw, stills, etc., and that's the side of that R5 that I was testing. When I got to the R5C and I'm shooting video, I'm thinking, like, I need to know how accurate this is. So the testing has evolved. It evolved from what I've learned in the process. It evolved from what I was doing, you know, in the whole process. There's also a huge amount of limitations in terms of what's going on or what I can test. So my test setup was really simplistic, almost to a fault, almost to the point of being not overly useful almost. So I used a Calibrate white balance card. It's the kind of white card you would use as a reference if you were shooting custom white balances in the field. I composed that as if I was shooting a custom white balance, and then I lit that with a middle to low end range RGB WW LED panel. So I used an Aperture Amran P60C, which has a standard color range. This is from the white LEDs of 2800 Kelvin to 10,000 Kelvin. But you can expand outside of that, and the light will flip over to RGB using the RGB LEDs and generating essentially the white that you would get at that color temperature that way. This is not the most accurate way to go about the whole process. So let's start with just the lighting. Some of the tests, I definitely went outside of the range that was the standard range of the P60C. And there's very definitely a shift. You can see it when you go from 2800 to, say, 2700 Kelvin. There's like the light very clearly shifts modes, and you can see the color change, like very pronounced. How accurate is all of that? I don't really know. And how does that impact the color balance testing or the white balance testing at the levels that are, the color temperatures that are below that? I don't really know. The second problem is I tested with simulating fluorescence. So I dialed green light into the tests. And this is part of the root of one of the big things that I want to talk about in one of the big frustrations I ran into this in this whole process, which is how camera manufacturers, lighting companies, and so on describe green and magenta shifts, or color tone shifts, or color correction shifts, and how little is documented in various manuals. So on the Amran P60C, the green magenta shift is ±1. I have no idea what that ±1 corresponds to. That ±1 could correspond to a lot, a little, who knows? The manual doesn't say anything. At least I couldn't find anything in the little bit of specs and documentation that come with it that says what that corresponds to. And of course, all the different camera companies, they have their own kind of standard for what their green magenta shift numbers are and all of that. So in the case of at least the R5 tests, I very easily could have massively overgreened the fluorescent lighting scenario. I set the light to 1, And it's entirely possible that 1 is just way too much. I could be percents, essentially is a decimal. So 1 is 100% green. 100% of what? I don't know. When I went back and did the same tests with the R5C, I ended up testing it twice, one at 0.5 and one at 1. And I'm still not 100% certain if that is the over the top, or if that was overgreened is the word I'm looking for, or if that was within reason. And none of this is, do I have a real clear picture as to how accurately it reflects reality? What do actual LED lights do? Or fluorescent lights do? Part of that is I don't have a standalone color meter. I'd love to have one, but the reality is a Sekonic color meter for cinematography is $1,600, which quite honestly, there's a lot of other things that I could do with $1,600 that would be more intelligent investments than just buying a color meter. Plus, it would be a lot less of a hard pill to swallow. Not that I really want to buy one, but it would be a lot less of a hard pill to swallow if the color meter also could be used as an incident light meter. It seems to have the capability to measure light and measure intensity, but there is no option on it to sort of flip it over and just make light, color, or brightness measurements, which, in that case, it would be at least dual purpose and something I use all the time, because I do actually use an incident light meter a whole lot of the time, especially setting up lights, rigging these kinds of, rigging a set, that kind of thing. It's way easier than trying to adjust on a camera and looking at a picture. So without that, and no real easy access to a wide variety of fluorescent lights to actually go measure and see what each one comes up with, and then the problem still is I have to measure the P60C, which of course I have a light meter for it at that point. It's just a mess. So that's part of the problem. The third part of the problem is really the test itself in some ways. Auto white balance is an incredibly complicated situation, a technique, approach, whatever. There's a number, I spent a good 2 days reading research papers on auto white balance and white balance before I got into this, and it's really a trip reading through the process. Obviously, I think most photographers take it for granted. I certainly did. I take for granted as well sort of the situation with, well, hey, I can look at something and my brain white balances it. It can't be that hard. My brain does it. And of course, anybody who's ever tried to do anything on a computer that's easy in your head, but actually tries to implement that on a computer, it turns out it's never anywhere near as easy on the computer as you thought it was, or it was in your head. So yeah, not as easy as it sounds at first glance. So anyway, I spent a lot of time reading research papers on white balance, auto white balance algorithms. And, like I said, it's staggering to me that some of the approaches that there's some approaches that are way over my head. Quite honestly, we're talking, machine learning techniques. I don't even understand the math on half of them. Half of even the non-machine learning techniques here's an example. The simplest auto white balance approach, and it's not very accurate, and I'm pretty sure nobody really uses it anymore, is called the gray world approach. And all this does is that assumes that if you average all of the color levels of the red, green, and blue channels, So you have one average across all of the pixels in your image, and you have one average for red, an average for green, and an average for blue. All you have to do to white balance the image is make all of those the same. So whatever you have to multiply the red and blue channels by to match the green channel, you just do that, and you go back and you apply that to all the pixels, and that makes the picture, the white balances the picture. It's called the gray world algorithm, or the gray world approach. Yeah. Like I said, it doesn't work really well. It works okay in some situations, but the reality is the world isn't always gray. It would work great on a white card, like the situation that I have in testing. And like I said, I don't think anybody actually uses this anymore because it's just not really good. One of the things that I found in the process of looking through the white balance and testing the white balance on the R5 and the R5C is that Canon very definitely has tuned their algorithm. Neither camera, if you put a ton of green light in, but your color temperature isn't in the range of fluorescent lamps, so somewhere around like 3800 to 4400 or 4500 Kelvin, that's where most fluorescent lamps end up falling color temperature wise. If you're outside of that range, the camera does a really bad job of correcting the green. If you're inside of that range, the camera does a really good job of correcting that green. And something in the process is, going through and figuring stuff out. And it's definitely, what's going on in the camera is definitely way more complicated than I ever imagined. Of course, I didn't really imagine how complicated white balance could be. There are, as I said, dozens of techniques, and most of them ultimately, one way or another, beyond like gray world that just doesn't care, one way or another end up caring one way or another about the image content. So the machine learning techniques are broadly put from the various papers that I read, doing something like making a very rough first pass, maybe using gray world to get an idea of where the color temperature kinda is, and then they're using machine learning driven models to figure out the actual color temperature. There's structural approaches, which this one totally blows my mind. I have no idea how these even work, but where you break the picture up into little tiles and you shuffle the tiles around, and then you look at what's happening at the edges of the tiles as they border each other. And I mean, I'm really simplifying this, and somehow the color shifts that you get at the edges of the tiles give you a more accurate representation or way to look at white balance. It just, yeah. The point I'm getting to here is fundamentally, to test the white balance on the cameras, I couldn't just do what I did. It's a good first step. It's arguably, I won't say arguably, it's to my knowledge, one of the first steps that I've ever seen in anybody trying to actually make a measured, controlled test of camera white balance. But when push comes to shove, you need to have a lot more complexity in the target. You need to have colors. You need to, average out, like you need a lot of research to average out environments and, types of images and how white balance should be composed, or should, how colors and whatnot average out or blend together, or however you want to look at it, in a whole slew of images to really get a handle on the test in a broad aspect. To be able to come back and say conclusively, auto white balance works in 99% of realistic scenarios between this color temperature and this color temperature, and you don't have to worry about it if you do that. And that's way outside my purview. I don't have the scope or the resources or capabilities to even, as much as I'd love to do it, it's so complex. And honestly, this is where a lot of the situation with camera testing comes down to, and why, truthfully, I think a lot of the stuff that maybe some of us take for granted, but also some of the stuff that I would love to see tested, just doesn't get tested effectively. Like, I would love to have a real comprehensive test of autofocus performance. Of course, autofocus performance is not just dependent on the camera and the algorithm the camera's using, so potentially the firmware version of the camera, but it's dependent on the lens you're using, because the feedback loop is camera to lens and back into the camera. And so if your lens isn't fast focusing, then the autofocus is going to struggle to focus quickly. Lots of complexity there. Subject matter matters. Lighting levels matter. Shooting or autofocus down at -4 EV is a completely different cup of tea than autofocusing at 18 EV or 16 EV. More light, things can be processed, or there's way more brightness, there's more signal, less noise. It's way easier to process and track things. Same thing goes for subject detection. That's a huge, suite of testing things. How reliable is it? How good is it? And quite honestly, I know companies like DP Review and other YouTubers and whatnot, we're all trying. We certainly aren't, not trying, I don't think. But, go out and photograph somebody on a bicycle and see how their autofocus tracks isn't really a controlled test. It's a real-world test, but it doesn't really give you adequate comparative information because, if you're photographing somebody on a bicycle on a street, you don't have control over lighting, you don't have control over contrast, you don't have control over sun angle, there's all kinds of problems, and, while sure, it would be great, that none of that should really matter, in the end, it very well might. And, if you don't have that information, or control over that, you're getting data. Like I said, I think everybody that's out there testing stuff is really trying to add to our knowledge and understanding of what's going on. They're not doing it wrong or poorly per se, but it's also, a lot of this stuff is just incredibly difficult to deal with or to test. So, more research needs to be done, is the short of it, on auto white balance on these cameras. More research, more test targets, more lighting solutions, more color spectrum, lights that produce light with different color spectrums and techniques, that kind of thing. Just more work needs to be done to really understand the ins and outs about what's going on. So that brings me to the last thing I want to talk about in this podcast, and then I'm going to wrap it up, and that is the biggest frustration that came out of this whole process of dealing with lights and white balance and color. And that is the way we talk about color corrections and the numbers or units or adjustments that we have on lights and cameras and so forth for them. When we talk about color temperature adjustments, so the magenta or the amber blue axis, if you will, of color corrections or white balancing, we have really nice, really well-defined units and standards that we work with. We have Kelvin and we have myriads, and functionally they're the same because a myriad is a reciprocal megakelvin, so it's 1,000,000 Kelvin divided by the color temperature in Kelvin, and you get a myriad or a reciprocal megakelvin, which Okay, SI people, I know you want proper units, and you've deprecated these old terminology, and you think people should say the mouthful reciprocal megakelvin, and it sounds cool to an extent, but it is a lot of syllables to spit out, where myred really was much easier to say. So I'm going to probably still say myred, even though they're the same thing. But anyway, both of these are incredibly well defined. And you can go to any camera or any light or any whatever filters for lights, and you can figure out what's going on, because it's going to either tell you the color temperature, dial the light to 5200 Kelvin or 3200 Kelvin or 6500 Kelvin. Or it's going to tell you the adjustment in myreds, which means you have to do a little bit of math, but you can figure out what's going on from your light source to whatever the color you're going to end up with. On the cameras, you have adjustments that are, straight up dial in a color temperature. Even when you get into the fine-tuning, the white balance fine-tuning on Nikon, the white balance shifting on Canon, the adjustments are in myreds or fractions of a myred, depending on the platform, and it's usually well covered, documented in the manual. Easy. The problem is the other axis, the green-magenta axis. Whether you want to call this the color correction axis or the color tone axis, or, whatever you want to call it, that's the problem place. How much green or how much magenta is being added or taken away from the system, the light. Some platforms, Nikon, do a reasonable job with this. Nikon actually tells you in their white manual for the white balance fine-tuning that the grid is ruled in quarter increment steps, and a change of so 4 quarter increment steps is equivalent to an adjustment of 0.05 diffuse density units. I think I've got that right. I believe I copied that out of the Nikon manual correctly. And of course, that raises the big question, what the heck is a diffuse density unit? Because that's a fun one to try and look up and find somewhere. It's essentially a unit of filter density, but it doesn't describe a color shift or a color change, or you can apply diffuse density units apparently to like any color correction filter. So, yeah. That's a fun one. Moving on to, for example, Kodak's Rat 2 filters. So these are, I don't know, you could call these pretty much the gold standard, maybe. It's what Kodak recommends that you use to correct for with any of their cinema films or motion picture films. They recommend, of course, it's their filters. And they use diffuse density units as well. The weakest Kodak Rat 2 filter ends up being 0.025 diffuse density units, and I think it's I think the filter is an 0.25 or something like that. And the strongest filter they have is a 0.5 diffuse density units, and I think that's a 500 or something to that effect. So there's a correlation between what Kodak's Rat 2 color correction filter numbers are and the density that those filters impose. Then we get to Canon. And I say we get to Canon because Canon provides zero information about this. They have a white balance shift. You can make adjustments in plus or minus green or magenta, or adjustments to green or magenta. Making an adjustment changes the number that's shown on the camera by 1 unit, and there's nothing in the manual anywhere that tells you what that actually represents. Nothing. I probably could have looked up what every other camera manufacturer does. If you don't use Canon or Nikon, feel free to look in your manual and see what kind of mess they use. If you're lucky, it's something that's useful and you can actually make comparisons to products from other people. If not, then, good luck. I looked at filters from, since I talked about Kodak's filters, I looked at filters from Lee. I've always used Lee filters for, Lee or Roscoe filters for gelling lights and so forth, and so I wanted to see how they rated stuff. They don't even tell you. Like, you buy an 8th color or an 8th plus green or an 8th minus green or a full plus green or a full minus green, and it could match Kodak's. It could be some other thing. It could be whatever they came up with, but I sure as heck didn't see anything on their site in the little specs thing that they list that said that this is X diffuse density units or what that corresponds to. And, you know, okay. Same thing goes for the lights. I already talked about the aperture P60C. The range is plus or minus 1. This could be diffuse density or equivalent to diffuse density units. That might make sense because in the case of the Kodak filters, they are like from basically 0 to 0.5. So plus or minus 1 gives you the ability to go from 0 to 0.5 and beyond if you really want to. Or it could be some completely different measurement that just, it's whatever aperture came up with. And of course, like the vast majority of everything out there, there's no documentation in the manual that tells you what the green magenta units are or how they compare to something from anywhere else. I don't want to make an assumption here. I mean, diffuse density units makes feels like a reasonably safe assumption, but I don't like making assumptions on something like this without either a way to measure it, which again, I don't have a $1,600 color meter, which would solve that problem. But again, a lot of money for something that, you know, I don't really do that much of when it comes to testing lighting color, or a comparative way to sort of look at what that is working out in a sensible way. And it would be really easy and really obvious for the manufacturer to just put in the manual what the number means, and then we don't have to guess. Then, of course, we get to the software side of things. Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. Their tone correction for white balance uses whole numbers of units, or whole number of units. So like 0 to, I think, 50 or 100 or something like that, plus or minus. What do those correspond to? Are they diffuse density units, but like in hundreds or hundredths? So like 100 would be 1, 0 would be 0, 10 would be 0.1, that kind of thing. Are they diffuse density units in some other standard or measure? I don't know, and I've never seen any documentation from Adobe that tells you what they are. You just drag it till it looks good, and that's, I guess, what is considered good enough. So if you know what kind of correction you need, you have to figure out what the adjustment for Lightroom has to be. The same thing goes with DaVinci Resolve. They actually go to 2 decimal places. Like, I don't know why. The whole number steps seem to be fine, pretty fine as it is, but we'll go to whole numbers plus 2 decimal places. So again, what do those end up being? And I tried to kind of look at this, you know, to see if I could do something. So I took an image that I shot with the aperture set to full green. I brought it into, or actually it was a video clip, so whatever the camera did, I brought that into Resolve, and I brought a still from it into Lightroom, uncorrected in either case, and then I white balanced them in both programs. And Resolve added 21.8 Resolve temperature or Resolve tone units of magenta to correct that image and make it neutral. And in Lightroom added 27 units of Lightroom tone corrections to magenta to make that unit neutral, or the image neutral. So it's pretty clear, or at least it seems pretty clear to me, and that's a pretty reasonable difference in numbers there, that whatever units Lightroom and Resolve are using are not exactly the same units. So what are they? I don't know. I mean, it's possible that some of that correction could have creeped in at somewhere, somewhere in the process of like grabbing a frame or extracting a frame from the video and color correcting or not color correcting, or some color correction step that I wasn't aware of happening under the hood, and that they were the same. But on the same token, I don't know. They were different enough. I mean, obviously they weren't polar opposites, but they were different enough that I had to wonder where the error came from, or whether Resolve and Lightroom are actually using the same units. Again, I'm going to throw this one out. If you have experience color correcting images or video in both Resolve and then frames from that in Lightroom, and you've done white balance and you know that the white balance is different or the same, leave a comment. Let me know. So I'm going to wrap this one up here. I think I've rambled long enough about this. This has been an absolute rabbit hole of a process looking at the white balance on these cameras. I did not expect it to blow up. I really expected this to be a 3 video process, one for the R5, one for the R5C, and then one to just sort of look at how to actually set white balance or set custom white balances and some stuff with that accurately. And it has blown into a way more complicated, whole process that I was absolutely not prepared for. So I hope you guys find this useful or interesting at some point along the way, or provide you some food for thought, because it's really provided me with a lot of, some headaches and some food for thought and some interesting insights into the kind of complexity of the engineering that goes into this and the cameras that I never really appreciated before. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this up here. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening if you're watching this just after it went live. If you found this useful or at least interesting, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. Finally, if you'd like to help support this channel or future videos like this, please consider hitting that thanks button and directly contributing to our content. It really does help. In any event, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.